There are moments that logic cannot fully explain, such as the fact that you stopped on this video, not because the title pulled you in, and not because you were actively searching for an answer. It feels as though something within you recognized a signal before your conscious mind had time to respond. A coincidence so exact that Jung would never describe it as accidental. According to Jung, the unconscious mind has a way of guiding you toward precisely what you need at the exact moment you are ready for it. It draws you toward encounters, words, and signs that conscious planning could never create. And at times, it brings you to a moment that appears small, yet carries real importance. The moment you begin to see what has been quietly directing your life from within. That is why pausing here can become a subtle but genuine turning point. Because from this point forward, you are about to come into contact with something that could make every other search unnecessary. Are you prepared to examine what has been shaping your life all along? If you remain still enough to continue, this path will lead you to a level of awareness Jung described as the turning point of an entire lifetime. Why are you still searching? There are periods when you observe your life and everything appears to be in order. Yet internally there is no real sense of peace, a brief feeling that continues to return, as though something is slightly off, as though something is missing, even though you cannot identify what it is. You attempt to change direction, begin again, or pursue a different goal. Each time, you expect the inner emptiness to fade. But weeks later, or months later, the same unease returns, quiet yet undeniably present. Jung once said, "The most frightening thing is to accept oneself completely." Full self-acceptance is unsettling, not because it requires effort, but because it forces you to face the parts of yourself you have buried deep within your mind. The pain, the desires, the confusion, the memories you tried to suppress or disguise. Because confronting yourself feels uncomfortable, many people choose to look outward instead. They keep searching so they do not have to pause. They keep searching so they do not have to hear what is rising from within. I know someone who, each time they felt lost, changed something. They studied a new subject, switched careers, moved homes, altered their surroundings, or completely restructured their lifestyle. From the outside, they appeared disciplined and driven. But eventually, they admitted one simple truth. They did not know what they were searching for, only that they had not found it. From a common perspective, this may appear to be a lack of consistency, but from Jung's perspective, it has nothing to do with determination. It points instead to an inner imbalance, where conscious awareness has drifted away from the unconscious. When these two parts are not connected, people begin to lose their sense of direction. They no longer know what they genuinely want. As a result, they start trying everything possible, not out of true ambition, but because they have not understood the silence of the unconscious. The unconscious does not communicate through words. It communicates through feelings. It sends messages through anxiety, unease, and those moments when everything appears fine on the surface, yet clearly is not. When this language is misunderstood, it is translated incorrectly. You begin to assume that you need a better job, a more compatible partner, or a clearer life plan. You believe that if you simply change your circumstances, the sense of emptiness will disappear. But that feeling does not originate from circumstances. It comes from a broken connection with yourself. Jung believed that every person has an inner center, a place that is deeply still and authentic, where one's true nature exists. When you live far from that center, even if you are successful, capable, or strong, you can still feel detached from your own life. It is like holding a map without knowing your current location. You may clearly understand the destination, but you cannot begin the journey if you do not know where you are standing. When you are unaware of where you stand, every direction becomes an experiment. You might imagine your life as holding a compass in your hand. You watch the needle spin and assume the direction is wrong. So you change goals, revise plans, and alter your lifestyle. What often goes unnoticed is that the compass is not spinning because the path is unclear. It is spinning because your own hand is unsteady. Jung believed people lose direction not because the world is overly complex, but because internally they are not calm enough to recognize what they truly want. This is why you can accomplish many things and still feel incomplete. You can care deeply for a good person and still sense that something is not right. You can continue changing and yet never feel a true sense of belonging. This happens because what you are searching for is not something new, it is something true. Not another person, but yourself. Not the future, but a reconnection with a forgotten part within you. Constant searching is often mistaken for ambition. In Jung's understanding, it is a sign that an essential conversation has never begun, the dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. When the unconscious is not acknowledged, it begins to direct your life from behind the scenes. What matters is that you are still searching, not because you are weak or lost, but because there is still an important part of you waiting to be recognized. A part that may have been neglected while meeting expectations, avoided out of fear, or dismissed because you believed you should not feel that way. The emptiness you are trying to fill is not meant to be hidden. It is meant to guide you. It did not appear to trouble you. It appeared to remind you that you have been disconnected from yourself for too long. And the most important lesson here is this: the feeling that you are not in the right place is not a sign that you need a new direction. Sometimes the message is simple. You don't need to move forward yet. You need to take one step back. Step toward what you've been avoiding. Step into that quiet inner voice. Step into a truth you've never allowed yourself to face. Your real journey begins at the moment you stop searching for answers outside yourself and start paying attention to the part within you that has been silent for a long time, yet never stopped calling you. When you look closely at why you're constantly searching, you begin to uncover a very different understanding. What truly drains you isn't always the external world, but the way you experience it. You believe you're reacting to life itself, but more often, you're reacting to the image your mind has created about life. The same situation feels ordinary to one person and deeply painful to another. A single sentence can pass unnoticed for someone while cutting deeply into someone else. The difference is not in the event, but in the meaning each person gives it. There are moments when you feel certain that you're seeing things clearly and objectively. Yet, if you slow down, you'll notice that what you see is always influenced by your past. Old memories, beliefs formed early in life, and emotions that were never expressed all quietly shape your perception. This is why two people can stand side by side, look in the same direction, and still live in entirely different realities. Jung captured this truth in a brief but powerful statement: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When you're unaware of what's operating within you, it continues guiding your decisions from behind the scenes. You believe you're making choices, but in reality, you're often repeating old patterns. You think you're responding to the present, yet many of your reactions were shaped long ago. Because you can't see this hidden influence, you label everything as circumstance, destiny, or someone else's fault. You can think of psychological reality as a pane of glass placed between you and the world. Everything that passes through it becomes tinted. If that glass is colored by fear, the world appears threatening. If it's colored by past hurt, neutral actions feel like personal attacks. If it's colored by a sense of lack, you'll always feel insufficient, even when you have plenty. The most important point is that you usually don't realize you're looking through this glass. You assume this is simply how the world is. When you live this way for too long, you begin reacting before you observe. You defend yourself before you understand. You draw conclusions before listening. And eventually, you feel exhausted, not because life is too demanding, but because you're carrying layers of unconscious interpretation in every moment. Reality is no longer just what's happening. It becomes a crowded space where memories, fears, and expectations all compete for attention. The awakening process truly begins only when you start asking a simple question: through which lens am I seeing the world? Jung never suggested denying emotions or doubting every experience. In fact, he viewed emotion as the fastest path into the unconscious. What matters is learning to distinguish what belongs to the present moment and what is being triggered by the past. Until you can tell the difference, your experience of reality will always be mixed. At this stage, a classic image from literature reflects what's happening internally with remarkable clarity. Plato's allegory of the cave. The people chained inside the cave see only shadows on the wall and believe those shadows are all that exist. They have never seen the sun or the true source of light. From Jung's perspective, the cave represents the unconscious. The shadows are psychological contents that haven't yet been brought into awareness. The real tragedy isn't that people are trapped in the cave, it's that they believe the shadows are the only truth. In the same way, we are not imprisoned by the world itself. We are imprisoned by how we perceive it. And once you realize you've been living among shadows, you no longer need to struggle against reality. You do not need to prove that you are right or that others are wrong. What truly matters is observing what exists within you, because that inner state is what makes the world appear the way it does. Real change does not announce itself loudly. It happens quietly and gently, much like the moment you realize you have been standing slightly out of alignment. With just a small adjustment, the entire view shifts. To experience this directly in everyday life, try a simple practice. When a situation creates discomfort, pause briefly and ask yourself whether you are reacting to the event itself or to how you are interpreting the event. There is no need to rush an answer. Simply allow the question to remain. The instant you stop fully identifying with your reaction, a separation begins between reality and interpretation. If, while listening to this section, you suddenly recognize that many things you once believed were absolute reality were actually shaped by your personal perception, leave one very short sentence in the comments as a marker of that awareness: I'm seeing more clearly. You do not need to feel certain that you understand everything. Just acknowledge the possibility that you have been living inside a particular way of seeing the world without questioning it. That small recognition alone is enough to trigger an inner shift. When you are no longer completely merged with your perspective, a space for observation opens up. Within that space, it becomes clear that some familiar reactions are not responses to the present moment, but arise from a deeper layer quietly influencing you. If the reality you experience does not come entirely from the external world, then what internal force determines how you perceive, feel, and respond to everything around you? For Carl Jung, the answer is neither logic nor willpower, but something far more fundamental: the unconscious. Not as a vague or theoretical idea, but as a very real psychological function that silently directs the rhythm of daily life, sometimes even living on your behalf without your awareness. A former classmate once shared, after years apart, that his marriage was generally stable. There were no major disputes or ongoing serious issues. Yet, whenever his wife mentioned minor complaints, he immediately responded by arguing and trying to prove his point. He could not explain why he became so tense so quickly. However, when he began observing himself, he realized the reaction did not belong to the present situation. It was deeply familiar, almost automatic. It was an old defense formed long ago, created to ensure he would not feel hurt. In those moments, the unconscious was not merely influencing his emotions, it was acting in his place within his own relationship. According to Jung, the unconscious is not an adversary. It is the part of the psyche that developed before conscious awareness, functioning faster than conscious thought, and remaining loyal to what feels familiar rather than what suits the current moment. The unconscious does not evolve with time. It simply preserves strategies that once ensured survival. While life circumstances change, the unconscious continues to reuse old responses because familiarity feels safer to it than uncertainty. Modern neuroscience reflects the same observation Jung made early through therapeutic work. Research shows that the brain initiates emotional and behavioral responses before conscious awareness has time to intervene. Conscious thought arrives afterward, acting like a narrator that explains and justifies actions that have already taken place. Jung recognized this clearly in his patients. People often believe they are making choices, when in reality they are repeating patterns, repeating reactions, repeating relationships, and repeating similar forms of suffering, only in different settings and with different people. You can think of the unconscious as a script written long ago. When a situation appears that closely resembles the past, the script activates automatically. You step into the same role without reviewing the lines. You speak the same words you have spoken countless times before. Feel the same emotions you have experienced many times before, and then question why everything feels so familiar. Because you have lived inside that role for so long, you begin to believe it represents who you truly are. It is only when you slow down and ask yourself, why am I reacting this way, that the role starts to become visible. Jung once expressed something deeply meaningful. He said that enlightenment does not come from imagining figures of light, but from bringing awareness to the darkness. The darkness Jung referred to is not something evil or unhealthy. It represents the parts of yourself you have never examined closely, never allowed yourself to define, and never felt safe enough to confront. When these parts remain unseen, they influence your behavior from behind the scenes. When you begin to notice them, even if you cannot change them immediately, they start to lose their complete control. The most difficult part of this process is not learning new information. It is acceptance. Accepting that there are moments when you are not as free as you believed. Accepting that some reactions are not rooted in the present. Accepting that for many years, the unconscious may have been guiding your life without your awareness. For Jung, this realization is not a failure or a tragedy. It is the start of genuine freedom. Because only when you recognize what is influencing you do you have the opportunity to avoid being controlled by it unconsciously. When the unconscious is not acknowledged, it functions like a hidden force, quietly directing your actions without your notice. However, the moment you start to recognize its signs, even slightly, a small space opens. Not to fight it and not to dominate it, but to prevent being immediately carried away by it, with simple recognition, such as noticing that a reaction feels very familiar or that a feeling does not fully belong to the current moment. You step out of automatic behavior and return to what is actually happening. To make this awareness more natural in everyday life, nothing complicated is required. When a reaction feels stronger than usual, observe three things calmly: what is happening, what emotion is present, and whether that emotion feels familiar. There is no need to search for its origin, and no need to reach a conclusion. Simply acknowledge the repetition. Often, that recognition alone allows deeper understanding to arise naturally, without effort. If by this point you realize that you have frequently been operating on autopilot, pause for a moment. There is no need to blame yourself or try to correct everything immediately. Simply recognize that the unconscious may have been guiding your life longer than you realized. The moment you see this, even briefly, you begin to reclaim your life quietly but genuinely. From here, the journey does not stop, because the unconscious does not exist only within you. It also seeks expression through the external world, through the people you encounter, the relationships you form, and the recurring patterns that suggest something remains unnamed. At this stage, the discussion moves into a deeper layer. The moment you start to recognize that the unconscious can shape your life, you also begin to understand that what happens outside of you is not always created purely by external circumstances. Certain people, relationships, and conflicts enter your life not randomly, but as if drawn in by a familiar internal force. Even when situations change, the same emotional tone appears again, the same tension, the same pressure, the same type of emotional clash. Jung described this inner to outer connection as projection, where the unconscious attempts to recognize itself through the external world. What makes this process difficult to detect is how natural it feels. You don't experience it as placing something onto another person. Instead, you believe your reaction is reasonable and justified. You assume your emotions are caused directly by the other person's words, behavior, or attitude. However, if you observe carefully, a subtle pattern emerges. The emotional response is often stronger than the situation requires. It is not only responding to the present moment, it carries a familiar weight, as if the same feeling has appeared many times before. Projection works like a song you already know by heart. When a situation feels similar enough, the song begins playing automatically. The other person simply becomes the instrument. The melody already existed. Because your attention stays on what you hear, you forget that the source is internal. Only when you notice that this same song has played repeatedly do you begin to question whether it belongs solely to the current situation. Carl Jung once stated, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This idea is not meant to dismiss your experience or suggest you must accept every situation. It points to something specific. When your reaction exceeds what feels proportionate, it is often because something deeper is being activated, something unresolved. In modern life, this rarely appears in dramatic events. Instead, it forms familiar cycles. You can recognize it through questions you may have asked yourself repeatedly. Why do I always encounter this type of person? Why does this pattern keep repeating? Why do I change places, jobs, or environments, yet the same feeling remains? As long as the cause is placed entirely on others or circumstances, the cycle continues. When you begin to consider that something within you may be reflected outward, the cycle starts to slow. Projection does not appear only in moments of irritation or resistance. It also appears in idealization. There are people onto whom you project safety, meaning, or completion. You believe that being with them will resolve everything. When that image eventually breaks down, you experience disappointment. For Jung, this is not failure, it is an invitation to return inward. A reminder that what you were searching for externally has always existed within you. Repeated patterns are not punishments, they are signals. When the same emotional experience returns again and again, it is not because life is trying to wear you down. It is because something within you has not yet been fully seen. As long as it remains unnoticed, life continues to knock in the same rhythm, through different people and situations, but with the same emotional tone. When this awareness develops, A quiet shift takes place. Others no longer pull you into automatic reactions as they once did. This does not happen because they changed, but because you no longer give them access to your unconscious blind spots. You no longer need people or circumstances to be different in order to feel balanced. Not because you become detached, but because you stop asking the outside world to carry what belongs within you. This, Jung would say, is a step toward individuation. You don't need to remember the technical term to notice the shift. What you can clearly feel is that relationships start to feel lighter, conflicts lose their intensity, and life no longer feels like a constant struggle. You begin to remain with your own experience instead of projecting it outward. That is the lesson. Life does not repeat events to exhaust you. It repeats them to help you notice what you have consistently avoided seeing. Every person who provokes a strong reaction, every recurring conflict, every familiar sense of, "or we go again," is pointing toward something within you that is waiting to be acknowledged. When you stop trying to correct the world and begin listening to what it is reflecting back to you, many repetitive patterns resolve on their own. This may also explain why Jung believed that when someone truly recognizes what has been directing their life from within, many external searches lose their urgency, not because every question is suddenly answered, but because attention has finally shifted to the right place. And when you stop projecting the same internal story onto life, life no longer needs to replay it. Number 5 marks the point where suffering becomes conscious, when the unconscious is brought into awareness. If earlier you began to understand that the repetitive loops in your life do not originate from the outside world, but from unseen inner material, this section addresses an even more critical moment. It is the moment when suffering begins to loosen its grip, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because what has been directing you from behind the scenes has now been exposed. For Jung, this is not the end of pain. It is the end of being unconsciously controlled by pain. Many people assume suffering comes from external situations, from disruption, loss, or unmet expectations. Jung, however, pointed to a deeper level. He believed that what truly traps people is not the original pain itself, but their lack of awareness of what is operating within them. When the unconscious remains unseen, it functions like fate. You react, repeat patterns, endure, and label it destiny. But once awareness begins, your entire relationship with suffering shifts. Jung addressed the nature of suffering directly when he wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." In his view, people are not imprisoned by suffering itself. They are trapped because a valid inner pain has never been fully recognized. When an inner experience is avoided or pushed out of awareness, it does not disappear. It returns in a more distorted and persistent form, quietly shaping life from behind the scenes. Jung did not promise a life without pain. He emphasized that whatever remains unseen is what holds power over you. The moment something is consciously recognized, even if it remains uncomfortable, it begins to lose its ability to control you. A clear illustration of this moment appears in Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. Raskolnikov is not tormented only by the act of murder, but by the growing division within himself. He attempts to justify his actions through logic, through the idea of the extraordinary man, as if intellectual reasoning could override inner reality. Yet the more he rationalizes, the heavier the inner tension becomes. What drives him to the edge is not external punishment, but his inability to continue avoiding the truth within. Only when he stops justifying, stops running, and allows himself to face what he has done and how it has affected his inner world does a breaking point emerge. The suffering does not disappear instantly, but from that moment forward, it no longer operates in secrecy. From Jung's perspective, Raskolnikov is not redeemed by punishment, but by awareness. When he clearly confronts his shadow, when he stops performing roles and genuinely faces himself, suffering loses its power to dominate him. This is what Jung referred to as transformation. It is not about changing external circumstances, but about changing one's position within personal experience. The breaking point of suffering rarely arrives dramatically. More often, it appears quietly. It may come when you notice yourself reacting too strongly to something minor. It may arise when you recognize an old emotional pattern resurfacing in a new situation. Or it may simply appear as the realization, "I've been here before." That moment does not resolve everything immediately, but it accomplishes something far more significant. It interrupts the unconscious pattern and brings awareness where repetition once ruled. You can think of it as walking through dense fog. When visibility is low, every step feels risky. Each obstacle seems to come from outside you. But when the fog slowly clears, the terrain itself has not changed. What changes is your reaction. You stop panicking with every movement. For Jung, bringing the unconscious into awareness works the same way. It does not remove the path, but it ends the experience of moving without sight. This is why Jung did not view suffering as something to fight against. He understood it as a signal, a message that something within you needs attention. When suffering is avoided, it returns in different shapes. When you try to solve it only through external changes, it often grows stronger. But when you pause and look directly at what is active inside you, suffering begins to shift its role. It no longer chases you. Instead, it starts to guide you. This is also why the Jungian process can bring the search to an end. When you stop running from discomfort, stop trying to correct it through outside solutions, and begin observing what is happening internally, many questions start to dissolve on their own. This is not because you suddenly hold all the answers, but because you are no longer asking from the same internal position. The practice itself is simple. You do not need to dig endlessly into the past or attempt to repair yourself. When a difficult emotion arises, place a hand on your chest and ask, "Where has this feeling shown up in my life before?" There is no need for an immediate response. Stay with the question for a few breaths. Often, that presence alone allows what the unconscious is holding to begin settling. It is here that deeper meaning starts to emerge. When you clearly see what has been directing your life from within, the need to keep searching for answers outside may begin to fade. Ending the search does not arrive with a dramatic awakening or a sudden moment of clarity. There is no single answer that overwhelms you. Instead, after moving through everything described so far, you simply notice that the urge to keep searching is no longer there. This is not because all problems have disappeared, but because you are no longer standing in the same inner place, viewing life in the same way. As Jung understood it, the search does not end by gaining more knowledge or experiences. It ends when you stop running from yourself. Most people live in a quiet but constant outward motion. We assume that what we are missing lies ahead, at a deeper level of understanding, a better version of ourselves, or a calmer state of being. So we study, collect, and pursue. Jung observed a subtle contradiction in this pattern. The more you search from a sense of lack, the more you strengthen the belief that you are lacking. If the root of this belief is not recognized, the search never truly ends. It only changes its form, focus, and language. A literary example illustrates this clearly. In The Alchemist, the boy Santiago leaves his familiar life to seek treasure in the farthest place he can imagine. He crosses the desert, learns from guides, and faces loss, uncertainty, and fear. The important point is not how far he travels, but where he eventually returns. The treasure lies close to where he started. not because the journey was mistaken, but because only by going far enough could he release the illusion that meaning existed somewhere outside himself. From Jung's perspective, this is not a fantasy story. It reflects a universal psychological pattern. We often need to go outward to realize what we have left behind. The search itself is not pointless, but it is only completed when it is no longer used as a way to avoid oneself. When Santiago returns, he does not become someone else. He becomes more fully himself with greater awareness, deeper honesty, and without the belief that fulfillment lies somewhere ahead. Jung once expressed this idea in a single sentence capable of ending a lifetime of wandering. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This does not mean reaching an ideal version or a flawless state. It means stopping the habit of abandoning the person who already exists. As long as you believe you must become someone else in order to live fully, the search continues. When you begin to remain with yourself, the search naturally quiets. Ending the search does not mean you stop learning or developing. It means you no longer grow from the fear of not being enough. You stop treating yourself as a project that must constantly be repaired. You allow periods of uncertainty without labeling them as failure. You allow yourself not to know without anxiety. And the ability to stay present with not knowing is a clear sign that you are no longer running. Psychologically, this represents a profound internal shift. When the search comes to an end, your nervous system adjusts its rhythm as well. You stop living with constant, low-level tension in the background. You no longer feel as if you are falling behind in your own life. There is no longer a need to compare yourself to an ideal version just to determine whether you are okay. This doesn't happen because ambition disappears, but because your actions are no longer fueled by unconscious insecurity. You can imagine the search as repeatedly digging wells in different locations, convinced that the water must be somewhere else. Each time you dig deeply with great effort, only to abandon the spot and move on. Eventually, when you remain in one place long enough, water begins to rise. Not because that location was special, but because you stopped leaving it. The search ends when you stay with yourself long enough. When the search closes, life doesn't suddenly become light in a romantic sense, but it does become more grounded and real. You no longer feel the need to prove that you're on the correct path. You don't feel compelled to constantly explain your choices. You begin living from the inside outward, instead of chasing external images to fill something internal. At this point, a different kind of freedom appears. Not freedom because the world has changed, but freedom because you are no longer in conflict with yourself. The final lesson of this journey is simple, yet if it truly settles, it can bring many exhausting years to a close. You don't need to become someone else to live properly. You only need to stop abandoning yourself in each moment. Life is already happening. When you remain present with what is here, whether clear or uncertain, a genuine steadiness starts to develop. From this place, life carries a different tone. Ordinary days are no longer burdened with the need to hold great meaning. You become more fully present in each experience, whether simple or complex. The search doesn't end with a declaration, but with a deep settling that allows you to stay. In this way, a new way of living slowly takes shape. There is no need to keep searching, only to keep walking alongside yourself. In the end, what remains is not a new idea, but a different state. A conclusion emerges, a light but stable feeling that you don't need to go anywhere else to meet yourself. After everything you've just moved through, the urge to search, to understand more, or to reach something ahead begins to soften. Not because everything has become clear, but because you are no longer separated from the experience unfolding right now. Carl Jung emphasized that the most important moment is not knowledge, but recognition. When you begin to notice what is operating within you, life stops being a series of unconscious reactions. You are here, and that presence alone is enough to change how you move through life, how you love, and how you face yourself. From here, the journey continues, but it is no longer a pursuit. You learn, observe, and experience from a different place, slower, more grounded, and with less resistance toward yourself. If you feel a subtle sense of settling right now, hold on to it. It signals a necessary pause. If you want to continue walking with deeper reflections on Carl Jung and the journey of returning to yourself, press like as a small acknowledgement of this recognition and subscribe so we can meet again when you're ready for the next step. No rushing, no more searching, just continuing to live with the awareness that has now been awakened.